So we're going to do a 3-week series on communion starting today. And the reason that we're going to do that is, actually there's a lot of reasons. One is that we get asked about communion probably more than any other subject. People are always saying, so why do we do communion every week, specifically that question. Another reason is that it's kind of a strange thing to do, isn't it? Communion is kind of a strange thing. Right? Imagine that you didn't grow up in a local body and you didn't gather with that body and take communion every week, and you just came in off the street and you're relatively new to it, and you're seeing people take a little piece of bread and it's supposed to represent a body, and you're eating it. You're eating a body. And then they take a little cup of juice and they drink that, and that is supposed to represent blood. Drinking blood, right? Maybe some of you have experienced the strangeness of that because you're a little bit newer to this whole Christianity thing. Maybe you're still just checking it out and you've wondered, what in the world's up with that? There's a lot of things that we do that a person who's never been a part of something like this might say, that's super weird that you guys do that. Did you know that? Well, communion is definitely one of those things. Another reason is that maybe you've never been taught about communion. Maybe you have only heard little, sections, like 2 or 3 minute explanations before you take communion of what it is. And then the other reason is that if we were to go through and sit down with every one of you sitting in here today and ask you, what is your church background and what did you learn about communion growing up? We would get tons of different answers. I know that that's true. In fact, one of the first answers would be, well, we didn't even call it communion, right? We called it the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or a common meal or the Lord's table. Okay, there are people who grew up in this room who probably came from backgrounds who called them all of those different things. And so there might be a little bit of confusion in regards to what is this thing that we do as Jesus' church called communion. Well, first of all, it's been a staple of the church since Acts, okay? The church did it in Acts, and they've continued to do it throughout all of church history. And I would argue, and I will, through the course of this series, that communion is actually the central part of our gathering. It's actually the centerpiece of what we do when we come together, that the teaching, the singing, the giving, that all of these things are actually leading up to the climax of this meal that we share together called communion. So our teaching philosophy, and you know this if you've been here for very long, is that we want everything we teach to be grounded in the ongoing story of God. So we want to have a comprehensive view of it, and that's what we're going to do with communion. We're going to study communion, and that means we're going to go way back in history, and it also means that we're going to go way deep in what happened. And I'm just going to tell you up front that specifically this message this morning has some difficult stuff in it. Okay, like some themes that we're going to pull out from way back in the story are really hard to swallow. So I just want to prepare for that. Our journey to get there begins with 2 major cities in the Bible that you might not know anything about. In fact, 2 major cities that you might never have heard of before. One is called and the other is called Goshen. Gets a very short mention in the Bible, but it's actually a very notable ancient city. It was one of the oldest cities in the world, and it was located in what we refer to as the cradle of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. It was in a region called Sumer. Maybe you've heard of the Sumerians, not the Samaritans, the Sumerians. And these are the people that are credited with inventing the wheel. They invented cosmetics, sailboats. They invented the first form of writing, cuneiform. They invented kilns, irrigation, bricks, a variety of tools, and knives. So this is like this really innovative, creative place. It's also a thriving place. Is a place where a lot of rich people live. There's mansions that have been excavated there. So it's the sister city to Eridu, which is considered by a lot of people to be the oldest city in the world. It's like the same distance. Ur and Eridu are the same distance from Waynesville and Bellbrook from each other, okay? So they're very close to each other. So Ur has this great economy, and it's a thriving place to live, luxurious city, has an advanced legal system, and it is the southernmost city in Sumer. And so what that means is basically southern Iraq right now, right where the Persian Gulf hits, although the Persian Gulf has receded since that time, but the Tigris and Euphrates flow down and they come together, and right where they come together, that's where Ur used to sit. It's not there anymore. I brought a picture of what it looks like now, I believe. There it is. It's all we got. Beautiful place. But it's here where we meet a man by the name of Terah. It's like a boy named Sue, a boy named Terah. And he lived there with his family. Here's what Genesis 11 says. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, his other son, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur, the Chaldeans, to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So this is the same migration that a lot of people around that time were making. Of course, we don't know all the details of why. We don't know what social class Terah and his family were in. We don't know how much they left behind. But we do know that Ur was a polytheistic city. And we do know that Terah was someone that worshiped idols. We also know that God came to Abram, not Terah, while they were in Ur. Stephen tells us this in his speech in Acts. And he came to Abram and said, I want you to leave and go. So apparently, Abram convinced his father, Terah, to go with him. And so they set out along this journey, and they head north. They leave their civilized, innovative, rich city of Ur. They head north along the Fertile Crescent because you can't go straight west. It's right through a desert. They wouldn't have survived. Nobody was taking that path. They went up, okay, and I'll show you a map in a second what that kind of looked like. But they go up, and Haran is like kind of right in the middle. It's 600 miles into the journey, 500 more to Canaan. So 1,100 miles in all. That's what they're planning to do. Planning to walk 1,100 miles. That's like walking from Waynesville to Denver, Colorado, with your family and all of your possessions. So this is no small detail. They didn't have aeroplanes, okay? They didn't have cars. They didn't have trains. Like this is a massive journey that they're taking as a family, big undertaking. They're leaving everything behind, and once they've gone, there's no turning back. Okay? There's no turning back. So when they get to this halfway point, they settle there, and we don't really know why, but we do know that Stephen tells us that Terah dies while they're there. And so then God appears again to Abram and reminds him to keep going. Keep going. Here's what he says. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation. I'll bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I'll curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We can learn a lot from Abram here, these three words. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him, and they took all their stuff. Then the Lord appeared to Abram, this is the very last verse, and said to him, to your offspring I will give this land. Once he arrives in Canaan, he says, to your offspring I'm going to give this land. So Abram, or later called Abraham, he actually spends the rest of his life there in that region of Canaan called Hebron. Okay, and then he has a son named Isaac. Isaac spends his whole life in this region of Canaan called Hebron. And then Isaac has a son named Jacob, and Jacob spends not all, but most of his life in this place, in this same region. But near the end of his life, he has to leave. And the reason he has to leave, or gets to leave, however you want to look at it, is that there's this big famine that spreads throughout that whole region. And Egypt is the only place with food. It's the only place with food. Now, fortunately, God had foreseen all of this happening, and he positions one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, you might know that story, in a position to where his family can actually get food from Joseph. Joseph moves his whole family to Egypt, which is around 70-ish people, and they relocate to Egypt. And since they have favor with the Pharaoh, because Joseph has favor with Pharaoh, the king. Pharaoh gives them this great land, and this great land is called Goshen. And it's north, it's almost on the coast, but it's on the Nile River. And it's this rich, luxurious, lush place called Goshen. And they live here, they flourish here. They live among the Egyptians, who are people of high civilization. They are actually the people who are on the frontier of mathematics, literature, music, and as you already know, architecture. Right. But Jacob dies, and his family, they stay there when he dies. And then Joseph, he lives his whole life, and then he comes to the place where he's going to die. And before he dies, on his deathbed, he says this to his brothers: I'm about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of the land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph recalls this original promise given to his great-grandfather Abraham all the way back in Ur, that the land that's called Canaan will be yours. God will come to bring you up out of this place to that land. But guess what? Joseph dies and nothing happens. God doesn't come immediately to take them out. In fact, they live and grow, and their descendants go crazy in this place called Goshen for over 400 years. For over 400 years, they live here, and they reproduce, they multiply. Not in Canaan, in Egypt. There's nothing to indicate during most of that time there's any reason for them to be afraid, any reason for them to be threatened, any reason for them to be sad. They grew exceedingly strong in number, and they enjoyed prosperity and peace, not in Canaan, in Egypt. So they're not in the land that God promised them, but yet they're living and thriving and having this great life. But they're in Goshen. But then after they'd been here for several hundred years, their comfort turned to pain when there's a new leader that comes to power in Egypt, and he doesn't like the Israelites. He sees how vast in number they are. And he says, man, we've got to do something about these people. They're a threat to our culture. They're a threat to our political system. And so they began to oppress the people that live in Goshen. And then they began to force labor on them. And ultimately, Exodus 1 and 2 says that the Pharaoh became ruthless, okay? The Egyptian people started being ruthless in their dealings with Abraham's descendants. And so they had no other choice but to cry out to God for deliverance. And Exodus 2 says that God heard their cry for deliverance, and he remembered the covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that sets the stage for this incredible event that is monumental in the moment of Israel's history, and because of that, monumental in the history of us and why we're here this morning. It's called the Exodus. So, I don't have time to go into all of this, but essentially what happens is God calls this guy named Moses and says, I want you to go back into Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Pharaoh says no over and over and over again. And then there's all these terrible plagues that happen, and Pharaoh continues to say, no, 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 you can't go. In fact, he continues to tighten the screws. He continues to oppress the people more and more because of this demand. He's trying to, match wits with God and say, no, I'm not listening to you. You will not win this. And all this leads to a 10th plague. This is the climax of the Exodus. This is God telling Moses the instructions of what's going to happen. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, they're to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male, and you may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day, so keep it for 4 days. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they shall eat. And they shall eat the lamb that same night. Eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it heartily. That just means be ready to go when you eat it. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down, and that does mean kill, every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This is one of those texts that atheists reference when they say, I have no interest in Christianity. See, there's a lot of confusion about this text and what's happening here. And we like to look at this text. Actually, we don't like to as Christians, right? We kind of set it aside. We're like, yeah, that happened. I don't exactly know why or what. I mean, that's kind of a disturbing thing that happens in that whole thing. But it actually confirms some massive themes in the story that are present from beginning to end. Okay? These are some themes, and here they are. Our families owe God a life debt for our sin. Our families owe God a life debt for our sin. So this is difficult for us for two reasons. Number one, because we primarily think that God should be loving. Okay, we just sang a song about reckless love, and don't worry, obviously the series is leading to that. But we just sang a song about it, right? Love, and a lot of the songs that we sing are about God's love, and we like to think about God as loving, but we're not as keen on thinking about God as holy. Right? So that's one reason that this is hard. The second reason is that we in the Western world actually have a different view of family than the classical model. Classical model says the smallest unit of society is the family. In the West, we say the smallest unit of society is the individual. In the classical family, the smallest unit of society is a family. And that means that the firstborn male actually holds the future of the family on his head. He is the future. He's the one who gets the biggest inheritance. He's the one who's being trained up to take over for the father. He's the one who everything is being passed on to. The hopes and dreams of the family live in that firstborn son. And so what's happening here is truly that the firstborn son has collective responsibility for the sin of all of the family. We have little to zero understanding or care for collective responsibility here. Right? But the firstborn son holds the responsibility of the family's sin in himself. That's what happens repeatedly through the Old Testament. This is a theme about the firstborn son. Now, what's interesting about this, that we often kind of overlook and don't talk about, is that the Israelites owed this debt too. That's obviously why they had to take the lamb and kill it, because they owed this same debt. That every family on earth, regardless of who you're a descendant of, Abraham or somebody else, because all descendants of Adam, okay? And so all of us owe this debt. Now, that's the first theme. The second theme is someone must pay a terrible price. Someone must pay that debt. Someone must pay a terrible price for sin. Someone always has to pay. Now, this seems like kind of a strong theme, but let me give you some examples from your life or mine. Let's say you're driving down the road one day and somebody hits your car. It's not your fault, somebody else's fault. Guess what? Somebody has to pay for that. It's going to be them, it's going to be you, it's going to be one of your insurance companies, but someone does have to pay for it. You might say, nope, I don't want to file anything here, and guess what? You just paid. You're just going to have damage to your car that's not repaired. You've actually paid the debt of that person. Right? That's what happens. Somebody breaks into your house and they steal a bunch of stuff. Who's going to pay for that? Well, you hope that the cops find that person and that they make them pay for that. But if they don't, guess who pays for it? You do. you have to swallow it. And does that feel good? You're just like, oh, that's great. No worries. I hated all of my favorite belongings. No worries. Those are simple examples. What about this? What about if a husband has an affair on a wife, or a wife has an affair on a husband? Is that just something that you can overlook? Somebody has to pay for that. It might be the husband or wife when they get the boot, right? Or it might be the husband or wife that was faithful absorbing the pain that has created and saying, you know what, this hurts really, really bad. You hurt me so bad, but guess what? Because I love you, I'm going to absorb that debt on myself, but somebody has to pay. See, sin never, ever, ever doesn't have a cost associated with it. To think that we can just do whatever we want and there's no cost to anybody else, that's ridiculous. That's a fairy tale. That's not real life, and we all know that that's true, but for some reason, we don't want God to be like that. But we do actually want God to be like that, don't we? Especially when we say, well, that person murdered that person. There needs to be repayment. What about ISIS? How do you feel about ISIS? You want them to pay for the crimes that they have done? About Hitler? Does Hitler deserve to pay? See, you do actually believe that sin demands repayment, don't you? Just not when it applies to you or me, right? But somebody does have to pay a terrible price for sin. And that night, that debt was being called in on every family in Egypt, Israelite or Egyptian. It was being called in on every family. Now, I'm going to say this is a hard phrase, but there was something dead in every house that night. It's hard, I know. Here's the third theme. A substitute can pay the debt. A substitute can actually pay for it. So God provides a way out for the Israelites. The English word Passover maybe does a little bit of an injustice to our thinking of what's happening here, because what God does is he unleashes this thing called the destroyer. I don't know, that's the actual word for it, not death angel, destroyer. God releases maybe a spaceship, I don't know, from Star Wars. It's the destroyer, and this destroyer is the thing that's going out and going to carry out God's judgment on all of this, on all of these people. He's not just going to simply pass over and ignore. The word Passover, the Hebrew word that we translate into this, actually is like a bird spreading its wings. And so you get the picture that Yahweh is actually covering the houses with blood on it. He's protecting the houses. That's what he's doing. But if Yahweh's protection is not over that house, guess what? That debt gets called in. One writer commented that rain falls on everyone just the same, but some people have umbrellas so they don't get wet. It's kind of what's happening here. You can kind of picture the Passover as an umbrella that's over these houses, protecting them from getting wet. Now, as difficult as all of this has been maybe for some of you to hear, and you're like, I don't like this at all, and I can't believe we're talking about this, you won't believe what God tells the Israelites to do next. You shall observe this rite as a perpetual ordinance for you and your children. When you come into the land that the Lord will give you as he has promised, you shall keep this observance. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this observance? You shall say it's a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, once again covered, protected, when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed down and worshiped. What? You're supposed to tell your children about this? I mean, how many of you have intentionally not told your children about the Exodus story yet? Because you're like, I don't even know how. I don't even want them to know about this. But God gives this as a binding ordinance. Every year you do this feast, and when your children say, what's up with this? You tell them. So make this real. When you bring a lamb into your house for 4 days and you feed it and you nurture it and take care of it, and when your children fall in love with it, because that's what children do with pets, right? You got a cute little lamb, a cute little baby lamb, and they're snuggling it and they're taking care of it and feeding it. And then on that fourth day, when you say, actually, we've got to take this and we've got to kill it. And when they ask you, why in the world would we ever do something like that with tears in their eyes? You tell them about that night. You explain to them the debt that we all owe. And you explain to them the grace of God. Binding ordinance. Tell your kids. Now, the view of God that your children might have upon hearing this story over and over again is God is holy. But also, God is good. This is an event that drives God's story forward. It's the Passover feast celebrated by close to 2 million Israelites. And the Israelites would continue to celebrate this over and over and over the next 1,000+ years, on and off, depending on their spiritual condition at the time. Many times throughout their history, they stopped observing it, which means they stopped remembering what God had done for them in the past. They stopped realizing that he is working among them and that he's their provision in the present. They stopped realizing that he has a future for them. Right? But the Jews eventually would rediscover the purpose of this. And by the first century, Jerusalem was bustling around this time called Passover. A community of 600,000 people welcomed 2 million people into town. And this was just this amazing thing. Preparations are being made for this day. And this is what Peter and John are sent by Jesus to make preparations for. Go get ready for this event. And this is the event that we commonly refer to as the Last Supper. Jesus and the disciples, they enter the room, the candles are lit, and they all reclined at the table together. Jesus lifts the first of 4 cups, cup of thanksgiving, and he says, I'm so excited. I've longed to share this meal with you, and I'm not going to share it again with you until the kingdom. I'm not going to eat and drink again until the kingdom. Then Jesus washes his hands, which is a part of the ceremony, which communicates, I'm the leader of this whole thing that's happening tonight. But guess what Jesus does next as the leader? He gets down on his hands and knees, and he washes the feet of his disciples. Then they began the meal, and Jesus takes the bitter herb and he dips it. And he says, the person I'm handing this to is the person that's going to betray me. And he hands it to Judas. Judas takes it, then he passes it to the next person, and then Judas gets up and he leaves the room to go and betray Jesus. And then they finish the meal. They eat all the other stuff, including the lamb. And then the disciples sit and listen to Jesus speak. Maybe he told them the same story I told you about Abram leaving that Ur of the Chaldeans and heading to this land that God would show them. That's the story that gets told on Passover. Okay? Maybe he tells them that story. But then he does something strange. He breaks an important tradition because the lamb is supposed to be the last thing that you eat on the Passover. Jesus takes bread again, and he says, this is my body. Take it and eat it in remembrance of me. And then he takes the third cup, and he says, this is the cup, new covenant, my blood. And then they pass it around, and they all eat it, or they all drink it together. So what Jesus is doing here is he's saying the Passover that's got us to this point, but there's something new and different that's happening now with Passover, which is that the lamb isn't the most important part, because the lamb, this temporary sacrificial lamb, that whole thing's going to go away. And there's going to be a new lamb that you celebrate and remember. And it's going to be identified through this bread and this cup, my body and my blood. The next day, Jesus dies as the Passover lamb. A new Exodus is born. He deals with sin once and for all. These are things that we'll get into a little later on. But he has to deal with sin because, remember, there's a heavy price to be paid for sin, and someone has to pay it, but no longer our sons. God's Son. In our place, to lead us into a new land, to lead us into freedom. Truly, that song that we sang earlier, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the what? Redeemed. As we take the bread and the juice together, we are proclaiming that we are part of the redeemed. We are part of people who have been called out of oppression. We've been called out of slavery, but we've been brought together in a community of God on this earth. That is the essence of what's happening during communion. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to dive into like the methods and a lot more. But that's the framework, okay? From Genesis 11 all the way through the end of Luke. We just went through this morning. Congratulations. You stayed with it the whole time. We're going to do communion a little bit different. There is communion at the front and at the back. And we're just going to invite you over the course of the next several minutes to get up when you're ready to go take the bread and the juice, and then you can come back to your seat. The first, we'll do first 7 rows. You guys come forward, and then everybody else, you go back. But truly, truly, truly see this as the climax of our gathering. This is the reason that we have gathered, because we are a redeemed people together. And communion reminds us of that it's through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that we're all free and we're redeemed. So come join the song, the redeemed.